Alrighty, so last week was Fifth Sunday, I think. Is that right? Yeah. So it's been a couple of weeks, but today we're in Daniel chapter 4. So we're talking about being restored from the insanity of unbelief. Okay, so as I alluded to a little bit in my prayer, this is one of the more unusual chapters in the Bible. All right, so I think you'll see that that's true in just a couple of minutes. And this really strange chapter opens with what is essentially a psalm. This is not what makes it strange, but it's true that it says, "How great are his signs and how great are his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion is from generation to generation." All right, so this is a theme that we've seen throughout Daniel up to this point, and it's obvious that this is something that God is trying to get the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar to understand. And if you've been here for the last couple of teachings that we've had out of Daniel, you may be beginning to understand that this is something that doesn't come very easily to Nebuchadnezzar. And that is maybe understandably so, considering that he's the most powerful man in the world at the time. But here's the reason that I said this chapter is one of the strangest in the Bible. It's written in the first person from Nebuchadnezzar's perspective. All right? So if we drop back a couple of verses to the beginning of the chapter, it gives us the context. It says, "Nebuchadnezzar, the king, to all the people of every nation and every language that live on earth, may your peace abound. It has seemed good to me to declare the signs and wonders which the Most High God has done for me." And then he gives that incredible psalm of praise of God that we just read. And then he'll also end the chapter with another psalm of praise to God. And so God and Nebuchadnezzar have been rather dramatically butting heads up to this point in the story. And the issue of who's actually in control and whose kingdom it really is going to find its resolution here in chapter 4. And so to kind of summarize what's been going on up to this point, one of the major themes that we've seen so far is Nebuchadnezzar's pride. Okay, so for instance, in our chapter this morning, in Daniel 4:4 and then in verse 30, it says, "I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at ease in my house and flourishing in my palace." And then it says, "Is this not Babylon the Great, which I myself have built as a royal residence by the might of my power and for the glory of my majesty?" So this is not a guy who struggles with self-doubt. Okay, like my house, my palace, I myself have built my power, my majesty. Dude feels pretty good about himself and his power and his place in the universe. And yet he's like just incredibly self-deceived about his own greatness. Okay, Daniel even has to remind him what the actual deal is more than once. He says, "You, O King of Kings, to whom the God of heaven gave the kingdom, power, strength, and glory." So Daniel's like always trying to remind him that, he may be the great Nebuchadnezzar, but there is a God who's greater than you. All right, compared to the God of heaven, you're quite small. And in his pride, Nebuchadnezzar is also blind to his own cruelty. All right, and we've seen this in chapter after chapter. In chapter 1, the fear of the people who are in charge of Daniel and his friends is that if they the new Jewish boys don't eat the king's food, then Nebuchadnezzar is going to make me forfeit my head. All right, so that's the way that he deals with people who disappoint him. Okay, and then if you don't tell me my dream and its interpretation, I'm going to have you torn limb from limb, he says to all of the wise men and the counselors. And then a couple of weeks ago, he says to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, if you don't worship my idol, I'm going to cast you into the furnace. All right, we're like 3 chapters in. All right, and everybody is being threatened with death. Okay, so this is a king that what he says is law, and he really does think that he has the right to punish people at his own whim. All right, but Daniel is like consistently and almost constantly attacking his pride. All right, why is that? It's because of the second theme that this book is trying to make clear, and it's that God is in direct pursuit of Nebuchadnezzar. Okay, and that pursuit is evident first by the fact that God is revealing his knowledge to Nebuchadnezzar. All right, in chapter 2, remember the dream and the statue. Okay, all of the wise men say, only a God could declare what your dream was. Okay, no mere man can get inside the king's head to know the content of the dream. To which Daniel says, there's a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. And then he tells Nebuchadnezzar that this mystery has not been revealed to me for any wisdom residing in me more than any other living man. And so he's saying, look, man, it's not about me. It's about the fact that there is a God of heaven, and he knows things that no human could know. And then after Daniel correctly identifies the dream, it's Nebuchadnezzar that says, surely your God is a God of gods and Lord of lords and a revealer of mysteries. All right, so you can see that like Nebuchadnezzar is beginning to realize that there is another power in the universe besides himself. Okay, and what is that power? It's Daniel's God. Okay, it's the God of Israel. He doesn't say my God or the God. He says your God. And so then when we move into chapter 3, we see the second way that God's in pursuit of Nebuchadnezzar, and that's that he demonstrates his power to him. All right, so when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refuse to bow down to the idol, Nebuchadnezzar says, what God is there who can deliver you out of my hand? To which they reply, actually, the God we serve is able to deliver us from your hand, O king. All right, and so then they're thrown into the furnace. But not only are they not harmed, but they're like totally untouched. Okay, they don't even smell like smoke. So it turns out that they were right. All right, Nebuchadnezzar has to conclude that blessed is the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel to deliver his servants who placed their trust in him and violated the king's command. All right, so it's the same exact pattern that was found in chapter 2, and he's starting to realize that there's something to this God. He's seeing evidence that he just can't dismiss. Okay, but he's not really ready to commit either. That's why he keeps referring to it as your God. Kind of wants to keep this whole thing at arm's length. He decides he's going to stick with what he's got, which is his own power and glory. All right, and as it turns out, God's not okay with that. Okay, so here in chapter 4, we see what is essentially the conclusion of the battle between Nebuchadnezzar's pride and God's power. All right, we have this clear picture of Nebuchadnezzar's incredible pride, and then we have the God of heaven pursuing him, and they're on a collision course. All right. So, who do you think's going to win a collision course between a man and God? This is picking up the narrative in verse 5. This is Nebuchadnezzar talking. And it says, I saw a dream, and it made me fearful. And these fantasies, as I lay on my bed, and the visions in my mind, kept alarming me. These were the visions in my mind as I lay on my bed. I was looking, and behold, there was a tree in the midst of the earth, and its height was great. I was looking in the visions in my mind, and behold, an angelic watcher, a holy one, descended from heaven. He shouted, chop down the tree and cut off its branches, yet leave the stump with its roots in the ground. Let his mind be changed from a man to a beast. Let 7 periods of time pass over him. All right, so Nebuchadnezzar is a little freaked out by this vision, and he's trying to figure out what it could possibly mean. All right, and then at the end of the vision, it says, this sentence is by decree of the angelic watchers, in order that the living may know that the Most High is ruler over the realm of humanity and bestows kingdoms on whom he wishes. So he's getting a little closer to the meaning of these visions, but how it relates to him necessarily still needs to be interpreted by Daniel. All right, so Daniel in verse 20 says, the tree you saw is you, O king, for you've become great and grown strong, and your majesty's become great and reached to the sky, and your dominion to the end of the earth. The Most High decrees that you will be driven from humanity, and your palace will be with beasts of the field, and you will eat grass like cattle, and drenched with dew for 7 units of time, until you recognize that the Most High is ruler over mankind and bestows it on whomever he wishes. All right, so we probably could have guessed where all of this was going. And I'm sure that Nebuchadnezzar's greatest fears were realized when Daniel explained that he is the tree. All right, Nebuchadnezzar's the tree that's cut down. He's the one who's going to be turned over to his insanity. And this raises for us today the issue of the insanity of prideful unbelief, okay, as represented by what happens to Nebuchadnezzar. And so based on the description that we're given, he ends up with a genuine condition that's known to psychologists today as lycanthropy. And so this is a delusion that comes and goes, where a person believes that they're an animal. So they act like an animal. All right. And about a year, it says, after this vision, Nebuchadnezzar is sitting in his palace, and he's overtaken by this insanity for 7 units of time. So most interpreters think this is probably 7 years. We don't know that for sure. But here's Nebuchadnezzar, the most powerful man in the world, lapsing in and out of thinking that he's a beast. And the reason he's given over to this is very clear. It's given to us twice. All right? It's so that you realize there's a God in heaven, or until you realize that there's a God in heaven. Okay, so in other words, you're not the last authority in the earth. Okay, that's what Daniel is saying. And so long as Nebuchadnezzar's unwilling to let go of his pride and acknowledge a God beyond and above him, he's going to be subject to this insanity. And so this sort of raises an interesting thought about what it means to be human. And the insinuation here is that there is a spiritual dimension to the inner problems that we have. Okay, the psychological problems and the emotional problems are in some ways the effects of the condition of our heart. Okay, and so that's not to say that there are not biological bases for our psychological problems or our emotional problems. I'm not suggesting that in the least, or even that environment doesn't play a significant role in the experiences of our life. Okay, those things are true and they're real causes. But the Bible does teach that there is like a critical place in which the condition of our own heart before God has a huge effect on our psychological and our emotional life. All right, so we're going to illustrate this in a few ways. So for instance, there's the condition of the heart where we have unresolved guilt. Okay, and so this condition is evidence of a moral problem that we have. And psychologists will tell you that when you have unresolved guilt in your life and when you keep the things that you have done close to the chest and unresolved, it's like a poison in your life. It's possible to become so overcome by bitterness for the things done to us that we're unwilling to forgive, or shame for the things that we have done, so that it drives people to a place of like neuroses, all right? It shuts out meaningful relationships. It creates these huge psychological or emotional problems. All right, but the origin of this has everything to do with the condition of our own heart. Okay, and so maybe some of you today can recognize this. Maybe you're a person who's been really hurt, and you've taken that injury and you've become bitter. All right, you can't forgive, or you won't forgive, and you've pretty much become defined by this offense against you. Okay, so that becomes the lens that you begin to view every person and every circumstance through. Okay, guilt and bitterness are spiritual problems, and forgiveness is a spiritual cure. All right, so secondly, we can talk about like a deep alienation. Okay, we have relational problems that come from a heart that's not right with God. Okay, and these usually stem from the attitude that like I kind of only want to be about me. Right? I will be involved with other people that promote my agenda, and then I will distance myself from those who do not. Okay, that's a condition of the heart that sets ourselves up as the center of the universe. Okay, maybe we have some relational problems that we're unwilling to have the humility to resolve. And as a consequence, many of us are walking around with deep relational insecurities. Okay, we measure ourselves against others, and we wonder what's wrong with me. Okay, so perhaps there's a sense of inferiority. Or in your competitive self-deceit, you've become arrogant. Nobody's good enough. Nobody stacks up to me. Maybe you're paranoid, right? Everybody's out to get you. Anger is pretty self-explanatory. Okay, and so this stance that we take where another person exists for our pleasure. And when you're tired of them, it's time to discard them and move on. Okay, we're predatory as a culture in how we deal relationally most of the time, especially with persons of the opposite sex in which we have any interest. All right, and these are conditions of the heart, and they ruin lives. And these conditions like drive us away from the reality that God intended human beings to enjoy. A person who has set their heart against God recognizes how truly alone they are. So I have to imagine that this is the most difficult thing in the mind of Nebuchadnezzar as he's out there alone and given over to his insanity. All right, depression, cynicism, anxiety, futility, purposelessness. Okay, these are the natural result of an honest soul's reflection on their alienation from God. These are the inevitable places that a heart that's far from God goes. Okay, there's a famous German philosopher named Arthur Schopenhauer, and he proposes that the most logical solution to the human condition is mass suicide. Friedrich Nietzsche was a proponent of might makes right. Okay, basically nothing is off limits if you have the strength to enforce your will. So you have to have, I have, a lot of respect for people who deal with alienation from God in an honest and realistic way. Okay, and so sometimes it seems like this is all there is. And that's where Nebuchadnezzar's at. Okay, but God was pursuing Nebuchadnezzar. He's battling for Nebuchadnezzar's heart, just like he's pursuing each and every one of us. Okay, just like he's battling for each and every one of our hearts. Okay, so it's God's intent to bring Nebuchadnezzar back to reality. And he has allowed him to reach a place of total disconnect with reality. And then he gives him these moments of clarity to like take another look and maybe make another decision. Nebuchadnezzar can rely on himself, or he can rely on God. So Daniel says to Nebuchadnezzar, "You will receive your kingdom back when you recognize that it is heaven that rules." So this is Daniel's consistent message to Nebuchadnezzar. You need to humble yourself before the God who is actually there. Okay, that's what makes all this stuff go away. But what's like the real issue here? Okay, the real issue is that God is the ultimate authority. Okay, this is the ultimate offense of sinful human beings, all right, people whose hearts are in opposition to God. At the heart of everything that's wrong in human history and human society and in our own heart, it's a controversy over who's the ultimate authority in my life. Okay, who do I yield to? And here's an interesting thought. Nebuchadnezzar's injustice is being met by the accountability of God. Okay, and therefore he's experiencing some problems. The only real way that justice will be served in the universe is if there's someone to enforce it. Okay, all of our indignation towards injustice and evil mean absolutely nothing unless there's a God in heaven that rules. Otherwise, like, what do we have? I mean, genuinely, if that's not the case, then all we really have is Nietzsche's might makes right. Okay, the Holocaust. Man is the measure of all things. And the strongest man gets to decide the units of measure. Right? So God is saying that it doesn't have to go down like that. Okay, there is someone in heaven who rules and whose will be served in the end. Okay, and that God that's in heaven is pursuing us. Not only because he wants to use us, okay, even though we defy him, but also because he loves us. And ironically, Nebuchadnezzar is the object of the relentless love of God. Okay, this defiant, cruel, heartless, tyrannical megalomaniac who barks like a dog and eats hay is the object of God's relentless love. And God is pursuing him. He's pursuing him because he loves him. And he's pursuing him because in Nebuchadnezzar is such a clear demonstration that no one is beyond the love of God. All right, no one is too far. No one is too corrupt. No one's too anything. This is an awesome picture that this chapter paints for us. And so we have a plea from God, from Daniel, for a change of course for Nebuchadnezzar. God's making his appeal through Daniel. He says in verse 27, "O king, may my advice be pleasing to you. Break away now from your sins by doing right and showing mercy to the poor." All right, that sense of urgency is there. Break away now. Okay, you've had the evidence already. Okay, there's 3 chapters worth of evidence that I am who I say I am. And you're at this place where I'm calling on you to respond. Okay, don't delay. Break away now. And when we don't break away now, we have to go through another cycle. So how long does it go on? It goes on until we wear out. So after all this time, Nebuchadnezzar has this moment of clarity, and it's different than all the other ones when he went back to barking and eating hay. He's worn out. Okay, he gets it. He's tired of it, and he surrenders. So that's the picture that we're given here. We're like Nebuchadnezzar because we have the same sort of heart that he had. Okay, we resist God just as he did. And we come to these moments of clarity where we realize that our marriage is in shambles because we're too selfish to put in the effort, or we're holding on to bitterness or to shame. And God is trying to ask you, are you worn out yet? Okay, are you prepared to break away now? It's not gonna go away. Okay, you're always gonna come back to this place of decision. And a lot's gonna be lost in the meantime. Okay, so let's make that decision now. Many of you are familiar with the message of the gospel. It's that Jesus became a man, he lived a perfect life, and then he took on your guilt and he died the death that you deserve so that he can offer you forgiveness. All right, you've heard that message. But you haven't said, I need to break away now. I need to stand under that. Okay, we put it off. We put it off. And what has transpired is yet another cycle of insanity. Another cycle of unresolved crap in our lives. The author of Hebrews says in Hebrews chapter 3, if you hear my voice, do not harden your hearts. Okay? Today. Now's the time for salvation. Not at some undetermined point in the future that may never occur. Okay, right now is the time for us to go before God and say that I want the death that you died to count for me, and I'm prepared to receive that. Okay, and now is the time for many of us that are in a standoff in our close relationships. Okay, we've been drawing lines and saying, I will not, I will not, I will not. Okay, but it's time to make a break from that now. And to call it what it is. And to say to God that I've been selfish. I've been living for myself. I'm not yielding my life to you. And I see that this is madness. Okay, it is madness. God is always there for you. And he always gives us these moments of clarity. He gives us the opportunities to respond. But they'll not always be there. They're there now. Okay, no matter where you're at. And we're just a decision away from reality. We're just one decision away from trusting God with the things in our life. And the things that are driving us to madness on our own. And when we're able to be honest and share that decision with someone who can help us, our lives will change. Lives change when people make a decision like this. And so as part of God's intent to bring Nebuchadnezzar back to reality, there's this hope of God's blessing. Okay, Nebuchadnezzar has that moment of clarity after however many years it's been, and he responds. He says, I raised my eyes towards heaven, and my reason returned to me. My counselors and nobles began seeking me out, so I was reestablished in my sovereignty, and surpassing greatness was added to me. He didn't wake up to a scolding. Okay? He became sane, and then God granted him surpassing greatness. He responded to God, and God blessed him. So what are your expectations for God's involvement in your life? So if you're willing to turn to him and turn from all these things that you've been given over to, what are your expectations? What Nebuchadnezzar learned is the same thing that children of God throughout all time have learned. When we entrust ourselves to God, he's merciful and he's gracious, and it's his desire to bless us. Okay, he wants to bless your life. His desire isn't to hold you down and put his boot on your neck and say, now look who's boss. Okay, that's not God's nature. God wants to put you in a humble place so that you can receive his mercy and his goodness. All right, so lastly, to make clear God's intent, there's this amazing end to this story where Nebuchadnezzar now has this personal knowledge of God. All right, think about who this guy is. This is a pagan tyrant. And he's had this experience with God. And he says, I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise, exalt, and honor the King of heaven. For all his works are true and his ways just, and he is able to humble those who walk in pride. This terrible man has written a chapter of Scripture. This terrible man has met the living God. this terrible man is our brother with whom we will spend eternity. I just think this is amazing. Okay, you can know the living God, the God who can humble the mighty. All right, true humility results in praise. Okay, because when we're humble, we realize just how magnificent God is. Okay, magnificent in his power, magnificent in his wisdom, magnificent in his mercy toward us. Okay, so there is this connection that when what's in our hearts is the desire to draw people's attention toward the greatness of God, it's because we have humility in our hearts. Okay, when we're humble, that's our impulse. It's what we want to talk about. We want to live as a witness. All right, so in closing, and to set some direction for comments if you want, right, I ask you, what reason do you have to praise and exalt and honor God today? All right, but that's pretty much all I'm going to say for Daniel chapter 4.